Some of the greatest works to come from animation have come from Dreamworks. From the likes of Shrek to Puss in Boots' Last Wish to How to Train Your Dragon and Kung Fu Panda. But before all of that, there was an animation that Dreamworks put out there. Well, two movies that are based off of different Bible stories that come from the Old Testament. The first one was called The Prince of Egypt, which focused on telling the first 14 chapters of Exodus. The epic story of Moses and how he led the Israelites out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. And the second was released a couple years after that called Joseph, the King of Dreams, which is based off of the second half of Genesis. And that one is about the story of 12 brothers who get very jealous of their youngest brother, Joseph, who they sell into slavery because of their hatred for him. Both of these movies are, for the most part, good in their adaptations of their biblical origins. Although today, we are going to be focusing on The Prince of Egypt. It's an animated musical drama that was produced by Dreamworks Animation and released by Dreamworks Pictures. The voice cast of this film is pretty stacked, with the likes of Val Kilmer, Ralph Fiennes, Michelle Pfeiffer, Sandra Bullock, and Jeff Goldblum. And with a score composed by Hans Zimmer and songs written by Steven Schwartz, this movie was bound to be a success. When the film was released in theaters on December 18th, 1998, the reviews at that time were mostly positive, with a lot of the praise going to the visuals, score, songs, and voice acting. The animation grossed a whopping $218 million worldwide, which at that time made it the most successful non-Disney animated feature. The song When You Believe went on to win Best Original Song at the 71st Academy Awards. This movie was a hit, and it still holds up to this day. A film that I believe has great biblical representation, and a movie for all that conveys to us the story of God delivering the Israelites out of slavery and into the Promised Land through Moses. Biblically, the representation in this little animation is, for the most part, well, the parts that matter, accurate. It's not a 100% word-for-word, bar-for-bar retelling of the first 14 chapters of the book of Exodus. There are clear changes and flat-out inaccuracies when you compare and contrast this film and the first 14 chapters. For one, Moses never washed up on the riverbank to the Queen of Egypt. He washed up to the daughter of Pharaoh. Pharaoh in the Bible and Moses had no relation to each other. They weren't brothers, nor did they even know each other prior. But at least the change is executed quite well in that regard. Moses never learned he was an Israelite through his sister. It actually never tells us in the Bible when Moses learned he was a Hebrew, but I reckon that someone told him when he was growing up, whether it was Pharaoh's daughter or his actual mother who told him. But Moses never struggled with the idea of being an Israelite like he does in the Prince of Egypt. But I get it. You gotta do it for the drama. Speaking of drama, Miriam doesn't play as big a role in Exodus as she does in this movie, but more on that later. When the film does decide to get biblically accurate, it portrays the accuracy pretty well. The burning bush is a great example, because of how close it is to how the Bible depicts it. Word for word, bar for bar, flow for flow. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. As Moses looked, he saw that the bush was on fire, but was not consumed. Moses does just that. He inspects the burning bush that's not burning him when he touches it. He, of course, is astonished, and is even more astonished when he hears the bush call his name. To which Moses says, "Here I am." The Lord tells him to remove the sandals from off his feet where he stands because the ground is holy. He tells Moses that he is the God of his father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then the Lord continues to say to Moses that he's seen the oppression and the injustices of the Israelites in Egypt, and he's heard their cry. "And I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Then he tells Moses that he's going to send him to Pharaoh to lead the Hebrews out of Egypt. But then Moses asks God who is he to lead the Israelites, that they won't even listen to him. God then tells him that he's going to be with him and that he will guide him on what to say. It's at this point in the animation that diverges from the Bible, where Moses starts giving excuses as to why he can't, and even giving God more reasons as to why he won't be able to convince the Israelites that God sent him to deliver them from slavery, saying that his adopted father slaughtered their children. But God aggressively speaks over him, asking Moses, "Who made man's mouth?" Basically telling Moses that he needs to have a little more faith. Overall, I believe this scene is phenomenal and portrays what Moses and the burning bush looked like. The next part in the film that I believe was admirably portrayed was the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea. The first plague. Yes, what was the first plague that God cast upon Egypt? Well, in the book of Exodus, the Nile, Egypt's main water source, turns to blood. "Go to Pharaoh in the morning. When you see him walking to the water, stand ready to meet him by the bank of the Nile. Take in your hand the staff that turned into a snake. Tell him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to tell you, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But so far you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. Here is how you will know that I am the Lord. Watch. I am about to strike the water in the Nile with the staff in my hand, and it will turn to blood." In the Prince of Egypt, Moses does just that. The purpose of this first plague was to make the people of Egypt's water undrinkable and to make the Nile stink, cutting off another one of their food sources because they wouldn't be able to fish. The silly representatives of the Egyptian gods, Hoi and Hotep, are actually in the Bible. The same response that Pharaoh had in the film to Moses turning all the waters to blood is the same reaction he had in the book of Exodus. But the magicians of Egypt did the same thing by their occult practices. So Pharaoh's heart was hard and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Then we get a little montage of all the plagues. The frogs was the next plague, as we see, then the gnats, then the swarm of flies, the fifth plague, the death of the livestock, boils, then hail, the locust, which did a number on many of the people's crops, darkness for 3 days. Then after all these plagues, after all this pain and destruction that the Lord has caused in this little montage, it's accompanied by an original song called The Plagues. And although there was no singing when these events were taking place, it's a nice little addition because it shows us the pain and sorrow that Moses is going through and the dichotomy that's at play between him and Pharaoh. But more on that later. Whether you're Muslim, atheist, or Christian, whatever you believe, this song slaps. You can really feel the emotion. Last but not least, we have the final plague. Pharaoh, still full of pride, will not listen. So God decides to pull the trigger and every firstborn male in the land of Egypt will die, including Israelites. The only way they can save themselves from this is if they take the blood of a lamb and smear it on the doorsteps and the intel of the houses, and the plague will pass over them. This, of course, is how the tradition of Passover came to be. This is portrayed pretty well in the film. Showing how the plague physically might have looked was very interesting. Before that, though, when Moses tries to convince Pharaoh of stopping this, we get some very interesting dialogue. Pharaoh gets to a point that he should probably finish what his father started when it came to the Hebrews.
And there shall be a great cry in all of Egypt, such as never has been or ever will be again.
This is a direct quote from the Bible, Exodus chapter 11, verse 6. A very powerful scene also in general. Using the cinematography to foreshadow the next plague was brilliant. After the death of his son, Ramesses finally lets the Israelites go. Then, in a wild turn of events, Pharaoh changes his mind. In the book of Exodus, it says that Pharaoh had his heart hardened by the Lord, so in a last-second decision, Pharaoh thought he could get revenge on God and the Israelites, which seems to be what happens in the film. The Israelites break camp when someone alerts them of the Egyptians. Stuck in between the Red Sea and Pharaoh, the Lord stops the Egyptian forces with an epic fire tornado. Moses sees this and the Lord tells him to take his staff and use it to part the Red Sea so that the Hebrews can get across. This scene is so wonderfully done. It feels so rewarding every time I watch this part in the movie because it's so close to how it probably looked. In the Bible, Pharaoh and his army drown because God closes the Red Sea on them. Biblically, they all die, but in the Prince of Egypt, it shows us that Ramesses is still alive, but just washed up on the shore. I don't really have an opinion on whether that was a good choice or not to show that Pharaoh survives. It's pretty clear up to this point that this film is not a 100% retelling of the book of Exodus. Pharaoh still being alive does give us a good final send-off on the brotherly relationship between Ramesses and Moses, and concludes that plot line quite well. Overall, the biblical representation in The Prince of Egypt is not an exact one-to-one, but when it is accurate, it does its best to stay true and faithful to the source material. Despite this film being based off of a Bible story, this animation and the book of Exodus is a redemption story. This film teaches us the lesson of holding grudges and the lesson of forgiveness, represented through two characters, Ramesses as bitterness and resentment, and Miriam as remission and grace. Moses was rescued in the river by the queen, and who was there to make sure he got there safely? That's right, Miriam. From that moment on, Moses was raised in royalty without ever knowing that he was a Hebrew. He would go on to look at his own people as nothing more than slaves, and there lies the betrayal to the Hebrews, to his own family. But when he does find out the truth about his genealogy, he goes through all 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. When he is commanded to go to Egypt to deliver them, he tells Ramesses that he needs to let the Hebrews go, because God said so. In this moment, this is where Moses betrays Pharaoh, his brother.
I do not know this god. Neither will I let your people go.
Ramesses, please, you must listen.
I will not be the weak link.
Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and his grudges that he holds against Moses throughout the film only grows stronger and stronger. After Moses is rejected by Pharaoh, he goes back to the Hebrews, and they are upset with him because now they have to work even harder because of Moses.
When did you start caring about slaves? Was it when you found out that you were one of us?
It's here where Moses realizes that he's right, and there's no way he can reconcile that, except through Miriam, who forgives him and all of his wrongdoings against the Israelites. I like to think of Miriam as having the spirit of Christ within her. She's a great representative of God, because like God, throughout the rest of the film, he never gives up on Moses. In this way, we can see Miriam's grace. In the song, The Plagues, Ramesses and Moses have a back and forth about the situation they're in. Moses says to Ramesses, "Once I called you brother, once I thought the chance to make you laugh was all I ever wanted. And even now, I wish that God had sent another. Serving as your foe on his behalf is the last thing I ever wanted. Let my people go, thus saith the Lord." In the same song, we hear Ramesses say, "You who I call brother, how could you have come to hate me so? Is this what you wanted?" Then he says, "Then let my heart be hardened, and never mind how high the cost may grow. This will still be so. I will never let your people go." And we get a glorious shot of Ramesses and Moses. The yin and yang of this picture is excellent. It tells you all you need to know about the conflict that is taking place between these two. Ramesses showing pride and bitterness towards Moses, oftentimes throughout the song represented through the color blue, which characterizes Pharaoh's coldness towards God, while Moses is in more warm and comforting lighting, which illustrates Moses' trust in God. At the very end, after Moses and the Israelites are able to cross the Red Sea, Moses looks across the water and says one final goodbye to Ramesses as he turns around to Miriam and his family, essentially saying to us that Moses has left that life behind and is never looking back. Although I'd argue that the greatest lesson we as Christians can learn from this film is to put our trust in God. We must trust God with our whole heart. But Jesus beheld them and said unto them, "With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." We must have faith and trust that God has a plan for us, especially when we doubt our physical limitations. Moses in the Bible and Moses in the Prince of Egypt both doubt themselves because they both believe that the Israelites will not listen to them, that Pharaoh won't listen. But in both instances, God provides them comfort.
"I shall be with you when you go to the king of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not listen, so I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders."
He answered, "I will certainly be with you, and this will be a sign to you that I am the one who sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain." God has a plan for all of us, and we must be prepared to do His will or we will face damnation. Psalms 139 tells us that God is with us always. "Where can I go to escape your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I fly on the wings of the dawn and settle down on the western horizon, even there your hand will lead me. Your right hand will hold on to me. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light around me will be night. Even the darkness is not dark to you. The night shines like the day. Darkness and light are alike to you." Moses puts his trust in God like David writes here. The last example is when Moses and Zipporah arrive in Egypt. Like in Exodus, Moses tells Pharaoh that he's come to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and that he needs to let them go. I really like how this is portrayed because Moses doesn't even hesitate and says,
"Behold, the power of God."
From here, at least in the film, Moses never rebukes the Lord and never loses his trust in him again. The staff turns into a cobra, as well as the other wonders of God. The plagues and even the final plague that God cast on Egypt, another great example of the importance of putting our trust in God. The Israelites didn't kill a lamb and smear the blood of it on their door seals for fun. No, they put their full faith and trust in the Lord, and they were saved from the death of their firstborn sons. We as Christians need to remember that God will always be with us, and that when we are called to do His work, we must put our trust in Him and do His will. To conclude, this film is a great animation with a deep message about holding grudges and letting go of the sins of others. Personally, I loved this film growing up, and it still holds up to this day. When I first saw this film though, I was not a devout Christian like I am now. Pieces of media like films and TV shows that try to capture the essence of the Bible will never be as good as actually reading the Bible yourself. This film doesn't retell the first 14 chapters of Exodus word for word. I believe that if you're going to do a film or a show on the Bible, it needs to be as faithful as it can. Obviously, in this animation, that doesn't happen here. Satan is the god of this world, so when it comes to forms of media depicting the holy text, we need to remember that nothing will ever come close to the actual Bible, which I encourage you to read yourself every day. The Prince of Egypt teaches us lessons of betrayal, hardship, and forgiveness. When you watch this film, the greatest lesson Christians can learn from it is to put our full faith and trust in God. And I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.